With that, we're going to start our lunch program, and our lunch speakers are, I think you'll really enjoy this, are Elizabeth Gore and Brian Wild from the firm of Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, and Schreck. And they're going to introduce each other a little bit, I think.
Hello, everyone. We're going to be introducing each other today, and so I'm going to start off. Brian Wild has been a part of the vast right-wing conspiracy for 25 years. His career has included stints with organizations and people who I don't like very much, including the Colorado Republican Party, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Vice President Dick Cheney, Speaker John Boehner, and Leader Kevin McCarthy. It sounds like I'm joking, but that's actually his resume. He also worked for Senator Hank Brown, who is a Republican that I do like. Brian continues to be active in Republican politics, but in addition, he and I have worked as colleagues and partners for the last 2 years, and we've found some areas where we agree as well. So let me introduce to my right, Brian Wild, my friend and my nemesis.
Wow, that's awesome. Everything she said's true. I really have no argument. So Elizabeth Gore, who is, as always, to my left, despite all of her charm and talent, is a liberal. She's at least a solid Democrat, if not a full-fledged progressive. She also has been in Washington, D.C. for over 20 years, although it looks like only 5. She did the opposite. So I started in the Senate and then slowly migrated to the House. She started in the House where she worked for both Leon Panetta and Congressman Chet Edwards. She then went to go work for one of the people that kept me in politics for a long time, President Clinton. She actually was in the executive office of the president and worked at OMB, which is really where they put all the smart people. She then left, went back to the Senate, worked for Senator Dorgan, where she was legislative director and chief of staff for over 10 years or so, and has now been out lobbying, and I've had the good fortune of working with her. Really super smart, very nice, just happens to make a lot of bad decisions.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Okay.
kind of like my children.
All right. Well, with that, we'll start. Okay? You ready to start?
I am. I get to talk about all the things that Congressman Tipton didn't want to talk about.
There you go. So here's where we are, just to set the table a little bit. These are our 2 candidates. On the poll that we had, everybody's not 100% on board with what the choices are, but they are what they are. Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side, Donald Trump on the Republican side. In case anyone's curious, I will be voting for Hillary Clinton, and we can talk to Brian about what he's going to do.
And I'll be voting. I'm not moving to Canada. Although I will say that poll, I was kind of fascinated by it. I thought Canada was going to win. So
I thought Canada might win too.
I'm impressed that there are folks that already know who they're going to vote for, or at least are, while not content, know who they're going to vote for.
I know, and it was also interesting that there wasn't anybody who said they weren't going to vote. So that's great.
There was one.
That's good.
There was at least one.
So we obviously have 2 flawed candidates. If you look at their unfavorables, these have been relatively steady throughout the race. And these are what we call upside down numbers, where your unfavorables are higher than your favorables. This is not a position of strength. But one of these guys is going to win. One of these people is going to win. And so whoever is president next year, Hillary Clinton, they are going to have higher unfavorables than they have favorables. There are 78 days between now and Election Day. And while there Well, there may be some additional changes, and the poll numbers may still move around a little bit. I think the favorable, unfavorable numbers are pretty much where they're going to be for the next couple of months.
Well, and I think everybody looks at this, and it's striking that you have two candidates that are so unfavorable. But this isn't actually new. You know, it used to be when Elizabeth and I got started in politics, you know, that if you had a candidate that was upside down like this and had more than 50% unfavorable, they were not going to win. And we've seen now in multiple cycles candidates from both parties, especially at statewide levels in the Senate races, win when they're upside down. What's striking is that both candidates are currently unfavorable. I would probably refer to it kind of throughout the week, but the current majority leader, Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, is a really kind of a fun race to talk about. So he won re-election in the last cycle. He went into the election with a 67% unfavorable, which for a sitting senator is pretty amazing numbers, and especially as at that time he was the minority leader, became the majority leader.
Amazing as in really bad.
Amazing as in really bad. And for those of you who've ever met Mitch, he's not actually a nice person either. Like he's a very good politician in the old school way. I happen to agree with him policy-wise on a majority of things, but he's also not like the warm, fuzzy, you know, hang out and drink a beer with kind of guy. Despite that number, he still won with 54% voting for him. So there's a whole bunch of people that hated him yet still voted for him. And that's going to be the case in this scenario too. Whether Hillary Clinton wins or Donald Trump wins, there's a whole bunch of people that are holding their nose with both candidates and are going to vote for one of them.
And speaking of that, one of the candidates is going to win, and Clinton has really held a edge when you look at the head-to-head pretty much throughout the election season. You can see on this chart a couple of places where Trump either got very close to her or even right after the Republican convention where he was ahead of her briefly, ever so briefly. But really, she has been relatively consistent in the national head-to-head of beating him. And one thing to keep in mind is if you're talking about a national election, you know, 4, 5, 6 points, those are big numbers when you're talking about such a large cross-section of the country. So,
and I think two things on this chart that are of note are, one, the striking decline of Trump. You know, these are typically on a chart like this, hopefully you're going to see fairly flat numbers. Even with Hillary, you see a giant up and down, but really with Trump, you see this huge swings of people liking him and then disliking him. He did get a bump after the convention. The goal of all candidates after a convention is to get that bump and then to hold on to it. He obviously didn't do that. You know, really a horrible week after the convention, and you know, we are now on Trump 3.0. So he has his third campaign manager just since he won the nomination. As a professional politician that gets paid to do this, you know, you never want to see that kind of statistic. That is very bad for our job security. It's also a sign of how difficult a time, I think, unlike, you know, with Hillary, Democrats are kind of flocking to go help her. She's almost turning people away, versus on the Republican side, you don't see a lot of professional staff. You don't see a lot of folks that have been campaigners for the last decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, knocking on the door to work for a presidential candidate, and that is strange. Normally, you're hoping your resume gets to the top, and you're using every connection you can to work for them, and that's not happening.
and I would say, though, that there are a couple of other, 3 to be specific, more events that are going to really influence these numbers in the next 78 days, and those 3 events are the 3 debates. And I think that those are events that could make a shift in some of these numbers. So it's something to watch for. I think Hillary Clinton is going to win this election, but I think anybody who rules out Donald Trump does it at their own peril, because he has overperformed throughout this whole process, much to my puzzlement. I would say, though, that we always have to remember that elections are actually done through the Electoral College, not through the popular vote. And when you look at the Electoral College map, Clinton really has a significant lead. It's hard to piece together, barring some sort of dramatic shift here that I think is unlikely, a path for him to get to 270 electoral votes. And this map that I have is from the end of last week, so there may be a couple, we have a few states that are pretty close, and a couple of those numbers might have shifted one way or the other, but I think this has been also pretty consistent for since the end of July.
So I have an awesome job of trying to convince people that Donald Trump's going to win, which I don't.
He hasn't even convinced himself yet.
I haven't yet, which I don't necessarily believe. I also think if I just take off my party hat and I don't see how Hillary Clinton can lose this election right now.
But sometimes it feels like she's trying.
She's a flawed candidate. It's upsetting as a Republican, I'll say, because in every way I think she's a flawed candidate. This was really an opportunity I think Republicans had. I like to throw candidates into three categories. There's big room politicians, there's middle-sized room politicians, and there's small room politicians. A big room is somebody that gives a great speech. A small room is somebody that's at the smoky room in the back, cutting the deal. And the middle-sized room is somebody that can hold a caucus or a group together. Typically, you have to be one of those three to get elected. You should be two of those three to win statewide, and hopefully you're all three of those to be president of the United States. I don't think Hillary's any of those, right? I don't think she gives a good speech. I don't think she can cut a good deal behind the scenes, and I'm not sure that she runs her caucus well. So this should be an opportunity. Trump at least is a big room guy. He doesn't give a speech that I love, but he gives a speech that a lot of people love. He packs stadiums, people show up, they actually buy tickets for him. He supposedly is a small room guy. I've never been in the small room with him because I'm broke and was in government service for too long. But supposedly he's a small room guy too. So he's at least two of the three. So this map right now is a reflection without any undecideds, and you never know. I mean, 6 months ago, I didn't think that Trump would win the nomination, and he did. You have no idea what folks are going to do. So there's a chance, quote Dumb and Dumber, saying I got a chance, that he puts it all together and he gets there. That's all I got.
So we thought we'd take a little detour here and just talk briefly about why this campaign has been so different. And obviously Trump is different from any candidate we have ever seen. Part of it is his personality. He has had so many instances of making comments and doing things that, my way of thinking, clearly disqualify him as being president, but it has not disqualified him in terms of the electorate. So that is obviously a huge issue. He's just a force that is different from anything we've ever seen before. But he's also used the mechanics of a campaign different from anybody else. He has no ground game. That is, he doesn't have field offices and community organizers and people knocking on doors and putting up yard signs. He doesn't have paid media. He's just started his very first paid television advertisements. I think they started this week. And he has done relatively little fundraising. So it is really the antithesis of what most, as Brian calls them, professional politicians would tell you you should do if you were going to run a national race. And so it has been a very unconventional candidate and a very unconventional approach that he's taken in terms of trying to move forward.
And he's, I mean, I think from a political science standpoint, it's amazing, and this will be studied. You know, your children and your grandchildren will study this race regardless of the outcome, because he has turned everything upside down. You know, he ran with a minimal staff. Typically, candidates use surrogates that are going on TV. They're going on Fox News and CNN and MSNBC and arguing for their policies. And he went surrogateless. You know, his response was he just picked up the phone and would call, you know, the Today Show every morning. You know, and he was doing everything directly himself. You're starting to see already. You see Hillary Clinton pick up some of this strategy a little bit. You know, she's more responsive, less programmed on television news networks, and starting to react quicker. I mean, the speed of his messaging, while erratic and not consistent, the speed of it is truly phenomenal. And his ability to be on the airways nonstop, 24/7, is really probably what got him here. He operated without a campaign finance strategy. He operated without a super PAC that was supporting him behind. He operated without a massive network of, you know, if you remember back in the President Bush days, and you had the Rangers, and you had these finance networks that were kind of these pyramid things. He operated without any of that apparatus, despite all of the other candidates who were really good candidates, right? We had several senators, we had governors, we had really kind of a dream team of a bench running for the primary, and they all had those structures in place, and he beat them all. So it's unconventional, it's fascinating. I don't know if it'll be the way that races are run from now on, but I think aspects of it have changed politics probably for a while.
Yeah, and I think I would say he has, in terms of his speed of response, I think that's exactly right. This is a race, and it's important to be fast, but you have to go in the right direction. And I think that sometimes he's had responses that have put him farther behind than they've moved him forward. And I would also say, you know, this slide just talks a little bit about what matters, and Facebook, all that social media, Twitter, small dollars. That's supposed to be a small dollar sign. It doesn't really look that small, but
it's DC. In DC, it's only billions.
That's what worked in the primary. The political parties and the super PACs didn't really play. And I think one of the key questions is whether this approach works in a general election. And I would argue that actually it doesn't work in a general election. And part of the challenge that he's had is that he's been unable to evolve his campaign into a structure that works on a national level. And so these unconventional, unusual ways that he was successful, clearly successful in the primary, they don't work in the general election.
And so all of this continued down the political science side of things and less the policy side of things. You know, this is populism, right? And I think, you know, you saw it. It's a worldwide phenomenon right now, and people want to tie us with Brexit, but it's certainly a U.S. phenomenon. And it's just a fun thing to dwell on why we got here. And I think it's fair to say, you know, both parties have gone through this. There's striking similarities in the fact that Bernie Sanders really ran a populist campaign, similar outside the Beltway, anti-establishment. You know, the issues that he hit were populist issues for his side, and he took Hillary all the way to the ropes. On our side, the populist won. I mean, Bernie almost got there. So, but I think nationally we're going through this. This isn't a Republican problem. It's just I shouldn't say problem. It's not a Republican phenomenon. Populism could be where we're going to get. So the question is why is populism there? And you know, it's taking off cues off of questions that I had heard earlier. You know, in why candidates why you'd support a certain candidate and why you wouldn't, and how, you know, whether we should throw all the bastards out, whether we shouldn't throw all the bastards out. You know, this is, in my theory, we're not at the beginning of a populist strain. We're kind of in the middle of it. You know, from the Republican standpoint, I've been in politics long enough that I got in and I was a conservative. I then became a full-fledged right-wing nut. I then became a member of leadership, and then I became the establishment. So my personal beliefs are unchanged. The right has moved significantly further right, and strategically, the strategies have changed, but the issues are still the same. I think that one cue of why we're here is when you look at income inequality, and this is not a Republican. We didn't cause it, and the Democrats didn't cause it. It's just a fact that this has happened. Is that top quintile of wealth continues to go up. You know, they're making money. A lot of them are making money on Wall Street. Wall Street goes up, whereas raw incomes, those of us that make our money via a paycheck, that paycheck has stayed flat. You know, George Bush, who I worked for, you know, made his effort to fix it. It didn't really fix it. I think Obama, I'm not sure if Obama made an effort to fix it,
I guess
it's certainly been exacerbated in the last 8 years. I think so. Some of that is the stagnant economy that's actually been stagnant for longer than just the recession we're in is some of the unhappiness that people have.
I think you're right, and I think that this is a piece of where you see the voter anger, people feeling that like they can't get ahead, and this, I agree with Brian. The growing.
See, that was one of them.
However, I think that in all fairness, efforts to have a more progressive tax code that would address some of these issues has been stymied on the Republican side as with calls of class warfare and things. And so, while I agree that the increase in income inequality isn't really a partisan issue, I would say that the Democratic side of the aisle has tried with more enthusiasm to address this through federal policy than the Republican side. But it's also the case that it is where we, I mean, these are the numbers, these are the statistics, and I do think that this is part of why you see this anti-politician, anti-incumbent, establishment mentality. And the other reason is the chart that you see there, which just talks about the anti-government sentiment. Now, I would argue that some of this is self-inflicted, and again, I think it happens more on the Republican side than on the Democratic side. But if you are a politician and you go out and in a lot of your rhetoric, you say politicians are terrible, people start to believe you, and then it makes it harder for you to argue why, as a politician, you should be elected as a congressman or a governor or a president. And so you see this rise in numbers of people who want a politician who is not a politician. They want an elected figure who has never been through an election before. And that is part of the outcome that's part of what has built up a Donald Trump, and to a lesser extent,
and,
Bernie
you know, I
Sanders.
think Senator Bennett, I thought, made some great points, and I don't typically agree with him, but he made some great points this morning on the 9% unfavorable side
And by
of
the way,
Congress.
lobbyists are one of those that are actually less than 9%.
That's us.
That's us, yeah.
Yay!
We're less than Paris Hilton.
So I get to be a Republican, establishment Republican, and a lobbyist. I don't even know what that is, like 2%?
It's actually negative.
Yes. But I think the way I like to explain the phenomenon, which I don't know if it's true or not, you know, Coca-Cola doesn't run ads that say Pepsi sucks. They run ads that say Coca-Cola is delicious and maybe good for you, and you should drink Coca-Cola. It makes you young and athletic, and you should try it. You're more American if you drink Coca-Cola. Whereas politicians run the majority of the billions of dollars in television ads that you're going to see just in the next 6 weeks are going to say politicians suck. And politicians are paying for that. So it's the equivalent of Pepsi saying Pepsi sucks, Pepsi sucks, Pepsi sucks. Eventually, whether you're going to do one of two things. You're going to start drinking Pepsi just to make Coke mad, or you're going to actually start to think that Pepsi might suck, you know? And I think that's what we've done. We've now had generations of politicians that it used to be negative ads were sporadic and they've always worked. So the truth is negative ads work. So they used to be sporadic and you did it only at the last resort. Now it's what we lead with. And we're spending billions of dollars telling you that we are bad people. So I think that 9% is I think Elizabeth's right. It's self-inflicted, but it's paid for self-inflicted. You know, and I also just, you know, on this anti-incumbency thing, you guys have been throwing the bastards out for a long time. When I started...
Not you guys.
No, probably. Yeah, no, I'm from Colorado. I mean,
Okay.
they've thrown all my bastards out. Although Colorado self-inflicts. So I did work for Senator Hank Brown, who is one of the kindest, nicest people I've ever met, and really a great first boss to have, because he's none of these things that I'm telling you everybody else is. But Colorado does have a horrible history of people that are really good politicians not running for re-election for a variety of reasons, probably because they want to live here, which you should. But beside the point, you know, that it used to be that a politician had to be in DC for 20 or 30 years before they gained enough seniority to be a chairman or to be in leadership. But it's now so fast. Congress has changed completely. From when I first came on, there's only a handful of senators and even fewer House members that have been in DC as long as I have. And that's crazy to me, because that's not the way it used to be. So just to fun kind of numbers. So in the last election, the United States elected 13 brand new senators. The election before, they elected 12 brand new senators. Before that, it was another 13 brand new senators. So we've had, and then in 2008, there was 7, right? So there are 45 senators of our 100 who have only known President Obama as their president. So we have we've been throwing these people out. In the House, it's even more dramatic. You know, in 2010, when I was still in the House, we elected 93 new House members. The following year, there was 70 new House members. Then there was 60 new House members. We are now well over half of the House has only known President Obama as president. So it's not new. Like I'll even make the statement. Elizabeth and I had on the drive up here this debate, which is kind of fun. I think the constant throwing people out is part of the problem now. Now we're reaching a point where we can't get anything done because these guys don't know how to do stuff. But we can get into that later. That's a whole nother.
Those numbers were fun.
We should have a beer for that conversation.
Whoops. So let's talk about where we think we're headed. So on this slide, the colors didn't show up super well, but I'll tell you what they are. So there's a picture of the House there that is in red. Basically, the House is going to stay Republican. They're going to lose seats this time, but I actually think that the Republicans are going to probably hold the U.S. House. And it's hard for Democrats to take the House because of the way districts are drawn, because of the gerrymandering. Listen, Republicans do a much better job.
It's the big square states. It's not gerrymandering when you represent the whole state of Wyoming.
Well, that's true. But I think that the Republicans do a much better job at the state level of controlling the state legislatures, and that's where these districts get drawn. And I think you would agree that there is some gerrymandering. Yes. So anyway, the next box there is the White House. It has a blue tint to it. And it has a blue tint. Democrats have something of sort of a structural advantage in the foreseeable future for the White House. It goes back to the Electoral College and the way the demographics are in our country right now. Democrats have a little bit of an advantage going in. If you have a generic ballot, they have something of an advantage going into a presidential election. And in addition, and I'll let Brian explain about this, but Republicans are not capable right now, in my judgment, of nominating somebody who can win in the general election. And the Republicans that can win in a general election can't get through the primary on the Republican side. So this is also helpful to Democrats. And then the Senate on our picture there is purple. The Senate sort of has been switching back and forth. It switched control 6 times since 2000. It's likely to switch again in this election. It's all about sort of turnout and the influence of whether you're in a presidential election or not. So we're looking at divided government for the foreseeable future.
Yeah,
I
don't disagree with anything she just said. I mean, I think we're going to have divided government for another. I mean, even I can't imagine a scenario where one party controls everything, except for maybe a 2-year window every now and then. I think we're going to be divided for a long time, and
there we have it.
I got nothing. That's it. It's kind of depressing, to be honest with you. So
well, except some people.
I'll say to just really quick on the electoral college thing and the redistricting thing. So to bring a little light to that. So the reason the House has an advantage, Republicans have an advantage in the House, it's somewhat gerrymandering, but really the way it is it's just we divide up districts, and we represent geographically more of America is Republican. However, population-wise. In urban centers where Democrats, there's more Democrats, that's where we get to the 50-50, right? So because of geographic reasons, not necessarily because of gerrymandering, Republicans are always going to have, at least for the foreseeable future, an advantage in the House. That works opposite from us in the Electoral College. So the concentration of Democrats in big urban centers on the coasts, you know, when you look at that, if you look at that map, the left coast and the right coast, which is also left. You know, that's just something we can't break through. There's not a great conservative message that gets through that urban population, and that's really why the White House is probably going to continue to be Democratic held for a while, until policies start to change and philosophies start to change.
Should we skip this one?
We could skip that one and go to questions, because questions are more fun.
All right. So we're going to, we talked kind of a long time. So we would be happy to take any questions if anybody has any. Nobody? Oh, yes, ma'am.
You have not touched on the impact of the media on the perception of either or both of the candidates in both reporting and in analysis. And I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Okay, so the question was, what has the impact of the media been in both reporting and analysis on the two candidates? And I'll just give my thoughts on that to kick it off. One of the aspects of this campaign has been that Donald Trump goes around the media, right? He talks directly to people, specifically through his Twitter feed. There's no filter at all. And you know, that way, there's no analysis by anybody when you get a tweet from Donald Trump that on whatever he's tweeting about. So I think that that has been a real difference in this environment. And Clinton does it less, but you know, they do have outlets where they're talking directly to you know, their constituents. The more mainstream media has become more polarized. You know, you have much more so than in the past. You've got Fox News, which is Republican leaning. You've got MSNBC, which is Democratically leading. And I think that what happens is you end up in an echo chamber where people are listening to what they already agree with. And they're listening to reporting and analysis that reflects what they already think is the case. My own view is that Trump feels attacked by the press, but in many cases, the press is doing what the press always does, which is fact-checking and trying to be a governor on the rhetoric that comes out of a campaign. And it is true that that Donald Trump says a lot of things that are inaccurate. And so it's not that they're ganging up on him because they don't like him, I don't think. I think that they are highlighting the fact that he has a propensity to not be accurate in the things that he says.
Well, and I guess I think Donald Trump does say a lot of things that are inaccurate, but I think Hillary Clinton actually lies. And I think there's a dramatic difference between those two. I think it's one thing to be inaccurate, it's another thing to flat out lie. And I do think, I am a believer that the media as a whole has always kind of soft pedaled the Clintons. There's a warm, fuzzy place they have for the Clintons as a couple. And I think that's continued. I don't think the media is necessarily, I mean, it's interesting because the media doesn't like Donald Trump either, right? And Fox doesn't like Donald Trump except for Sean Hannity, who's advising him at the moment. They don't like him as much as they've liked other candidates in the past. But I do think the media has let Hillary Clinton get by with a whole bunch of stuff that they wouldn't let another candidate get by with. And I mean, it's disappointing, but I've now been in this business long enough to just know this is the way it is, and it happens every single time. Dang it.
Wow. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
I like that all the questions are coming from the right, at least my right.
Hello. You envision a Democratic White House for the foreseeable future or near future, unless policies change. Do you see where the parties can actually change, or do you envision a third party coming up at some point? Legitimate third party. So
I love the third party idea. I've always been a fan. I actually think we probably need a fourth party. Like if you're really going to do it, you know, I think that there's a clean split on the Democratic side between progressives and mainstream Democrats. I think there's a pretty clean split on the Republican side between libertarians and conservatives. And I would love to see a four-party system where you could create an actual caucus, have more of a parliamentary type thing where you're building a majority that way. I mean, structurally, we've created a whole bunch of campaign finance laws, a whole bunch of structure behind the two-party system. It is very difficult. I think Gary Johnson's discovering that. I think he'll get a solid vote, but maybe not even Ross Perot good a vote. It's just structurally so hard to get on a ballot in 50 states and then to put together that team. You need a lot of money, and you need a lot of lawyers, and you need a run of multiple years to build up. And these third parties come together, or people look at a third party option always at the last minute, you know, in the last 6 months of a race. So I think for the third party to really work, we have to start building whatever it is that structure is going to be now for the next cycle. I think what's more likely to happen is and I think stepping back, I think divided government, there's an opportunity that Congress is going to do a lot next year. Like divided government doesn't necessarily mean that nothing happens. I think if the Republicans lose the Senate, which I agree, I think we're likely to lose, or it'll maybe go down to almost a 50-50 Senate, it empowers a whole bunch of Republicans to side with Democrats and get stuff done. Those Republicans can't do that when they're in the majority. And I think that Paul Ryan, who is in a, you got to feel sorry for the guy. He's in such a tough spot in the House. I mean, he's just a hell of a nice guy. He's like, just feel sorry for him. But I think stuff can happen. And we can make law, we can make substantial law in a divided government. You're just not going to make these earth-changing policy changes in a divided government. You're going to do infrastructure reform, which I think there's agreement on. You're going to, there's tweaks and expensive stuff that we could do, but not philosophical stuff. And that maybe wasn't the answer to your question, but I got sideways.
So let me make a couple of comments. I think if you ask, are the parties going to change, or is there opportunity for them to change? To some extent, if Hillary wins, and I think she will, there's not a big incentive for Democrats to make a big change, right? They just won the White House for the third election in a row. On the Republican side, I think that it is difficult for them to agree on what went wrong, and I think it is difficult for them to lead from the RNC, as Reince has found out. It is hard to change the party from the top down, and so you need to have changes from the bottom up, and I don't see that happening in the short term. Maybe you end up with a core group of people who feel like that electability is a more important factor than it has been in the past on the Republican side. But some folks, their view is we'd rather be pure and lose. We'd rather be a pure conservative and lose. And if that's what their philosophy is, the party's not going to change, and they're going to lose.
And really what you need, I think, and we're probably talking too long, but is you need that super candidate. You know, the Republican Party that we have today is still the party of Reagan. Up until Ronald Reagan, we were not a pro-life party. We were a pro-choice party. Up until Reagan, the issues of smaller government and everything were embraced by a section of Republicans, but not by everybody. I mean, the biggest tax cut up until Reagan was Kennedy. So Reagan was a dynamic figure that came through with a whole bunch of policy ideas that we now think Republicans have always believed in, but we didn't believe in them until 1980. And I think Bill Clinton is in some degrees the same thing to the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was all kinds of things. And then he came through in 1992 and really made the modern model. So I think what Republicans need right now, and we obviously don't have it, is we need that coalescing super candidate that comes through and says, this is what I believe in, whatever this is, and rebuilds what our issue set is. And says, you know, my party is now this, this, and this. And right now, we're still arguing over what this, and this we are. We're still just beating the living crud out of each other.
Okay.
Just following up briefly, how do you address the fact that I believe the largest bloc in Colorado anymore is independents, and both of you are Republican, Democrat. How do you address that in terms of the politics you're talking about?
In terms of party politics?
Yeah, where do the independents fit, I guess, in the way that you're viewing the election, maybe even further out?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
So one,
Brian?
I think independents are a problem, actually. And the reason they're a problem is because they are a majority of the electorate, but they're not voting in the primary. So this comes to what Elizabeth had said. Republicans cannot nominate a candidate that can win in the general election because the Republicans that are voting in the primary are self-identified Republicans. And then when the majority of the vote is, they're not a majority of the vote. So you get to the general election, you have all these independents, and you have, you know, squishy Ds, and you have like possible people you can pick up on the left. And it just doesn't work. So if all those independents, of which technically I probably, if I wasn't paid to be a Republican, I'd probably be an independent as well, because I wouldn't want to self-identify. But if all those independents got engaged and voted in the primary, we would have substantially better candidates. And those candidates would be far more reflective of what your views are. But when the only time you vote is November, then you're left with what you got.
The other thing I would say about independence is there's some research that shows that if you vote with a certain party, I think it's 3 presidential elections in a row, that you really start to identify yourself as a member of that party, even if you're not registered with that party. And so I think that really holds more with a national election, because I think state and local elections are more governed by local issues and people are more willing to split their ticket there. But one thing that's interesting about independents is if you end up with a trend where independents are voting one way, you can expect that trend is going to continue.